art, or the Makerere, that is the Margaret Fowell School, or they have been part of this workshop that are led by John Lott and others, or the College of Fine and Applied Art in the one established by John Lott and others, or Senghor has been a major role and somebody who encouraged this initiative in Dakar. So those are colleges that are established in the colonial period, but then people were taught according to the European, tenets and system of education and so forth. So modernity becomes, African modernity becomes like derivative, or African modernism becomes derivative of the larger. It's like a second rate or the source of modern European art. And the comparison has always been, oh, he was influenced by Picasso, like Salah and so forth. So that has been the narrative. So, but there are other people who work within other Western canons. For example, Rashid Araim. For us at the time, he was the one who established Black Orpheus, then he shifted to, Black Phoenix, not Black Orpheus. Black Orpheus is done by Oli Bayer did Black Orpheus. So he established Black Phoenix, and he was part of the larger Black art movement within England, which is a late 70s, early 80s movement. But then he established third text. And he started writing articles about how to really theorize modernism outside West, how to think about non-Western artists from part of the Western metropole. People like him, like Salah and others. And I remember at the time, which was in the late 80s, maybe 1987, perhaps there was the Magician de la Tête. At that time, I was still in graduate school. So Rashid did first of all, a critique of that show. Then he did a whole show that's called The Other Story, in which he just basically featured non-Western artists who are living in the Western metropole, and specifically London. So all these names that you know will be now canonized and collected, and their prices in the art market skyrocketing, David Madala and others. These are people like Rashid Araim and others really played a great role through that show, which is a historic show that is known as The Other Story. So these are the kind of source of inspiration. Like, we didn't come just out of nothing. We really had this legacy of other people who tried to theorize this. So they were very influential in our thinking. So we started to think it's not about being derivative. And then to think about modernity as a global phenomenon, that even within the West, modernity is not even. It was earlier in France, and for example in Britain, it's really late if you compare it to the other. We started thinking about how do we really think about African modernism within this context, and then we start thinking, okay, what distinguishes us as colonized nations, and what happened in terms of other intellectual movement. Then you find suddenly there is negritude, there's Pan-Africanism, there are other people who try to theorize this. So these are all sources of inspiration at the time that we started thinking about what distinguishes African modernism. Of course, it came out in the era, or at least was in the era of decolonization. So that is one major feature. It was, of course, in post-independence, there was a lot of support after independence for art movement, for artistic revival in the early days. Senghor is an example, and so forth. There were movements by African and African diaspora people in terms of gathering people to think about modernity. You have the 1956 conference of the world Negro writers and artists in Paris, which brought all these big names that we know about today, like Fanon, Ernest Césaire, Présence Africaine as a magazine, Alioune Diop. All of those people gathered there. They were literally in their 20s or perhaps 30s. And if you read at that time, you find them debating negritude, debating modernity, had all these questions. And Ghana figured out, okay, prominently in these debates, because of Nkrumah's links to several of the people who were intellectual, Du Bois or others, even though Du Bois didn't attend, Richard Wright, if you look at his history. Then you have the 1966, the World Negro Festival of Arts in Dakar. Then you have 1969. So there is a legacy of things to look at, which we just unfortunately didn't study. If you look at the collection of, they're all part of the President's African Journal. There's a special issue for 1956. There's a special issue of 1956 and then 1966 in Dakar. Then the Algerian followed in 1969. Then Festag in 77. All of those have been meeting places for the people now we know as African Mormons. Salah and all of those people have been in those meetings. So the movement has been linked to this kind of diasporic thinking. The idea of them moving in and out of the West has been very important in the formation of non-Western literature, specifically African Mormon. So these are the sources of how we started thinking about African Mormonism. That there is a literature, there's a corpus of literature that you can actually look into for inspiration. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah,
this is the beginning of us thinking differently.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the major problem that we faced at the time is the exclusionary practices within those artistic departments or within the larger publishing industry. And that actually inspired us to say, okay, at that time, if you apply to African Art Magazine, which is ironically started in UCLA in the 1669, and it was established by John Povey, who was actually interested in the contemporary. You go in 1969, you find an article on Salah, very extensive one, and by other African moralists. Then suddenly that kind of interest dropped, and it became mostly focused on classical and traditional art. That's not to say I'm dismissive of those type of art. In fact, it's important to study with a new lens. But you could not publish at that time as an academic in the West in those articles. Not in Art Bulletin, not in Art Journal, not in all the mainstream. You're always directed to look for something else. And that actually what inspired us, of course, with the initiative that was led by Oki and myself joined in and Odu at the time. So we established the journal, I don't know if some of you are familiar with it, Inca Journal for Country Africana. That was in 1994. We barely out of graduate school. Mm-hmm. We established that magazine. It started in New York, in Oakwood Place, and then with the second issue we moved it to Cornell. I managed to find funding. And so looking for these kind of initiatives, I can tell you more if you want to know about it, but these are the things that led us to curating, to thinking about publishing, that we found, okay, if other venues can publish, then why don't we establish our own venues and what avenues? And that's how Inca came into existence as a forum in which we could try our own writing, and it has been successful. It has been existing since 1994. So I'll give you a chance maybe to say something.
When we first met, which was in 2001, you curated Authentic Eccentric at the Venice Biennial. And, I was really young at the time, and I remember I didn't have any money, but I was like, I have to be there. I have to be at this African pavilion in Venice, and I arrived in Venice. I didn't know where I was going to stay, but I got there, and I got there just before the press conference. And at the time, I was young and enthusiastic, and I asked you at the press conference, and I said, why is everything happening in the West? Why isn't it happening actually on the ground, on the continent? And so my question to you now is, there is so much happening on the continent now, and I think what's really exciting and interesting about what's happening here, for example, in terms of this kind of narrativizing and formation of new modernities, I would want to ask you, what would be your advice, or what would be your, like, from all that you've seen and experienced, we're kind of in the process now of, I feel like, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like we're almost kind of trying to formulate a new language, trying to formulate new kinds of institutions, Tiny What is part of that, new types of almost alternative systems that are, when you say that, modernity, I remember I went to a talk by Opie once at Tate, and he said something that I found quite jarring at the time, which he said something like, Africa is outside of modernity or something, some comment like that. I can't remember exactly what it is, but I remember I wrote it down. And I feel like right now, we're in this process where we're trying to, it's kind of like the postmodernist moment where we are saying we don't need to react to anything anymore. We don't need to affirm ourselves anymore as like being who we are. We are just kind of taking this and we're taking this and we're taking this and we're taking this, and out of that we're creating something new. And we don't know what it is yet, we don't know what it looks like yet, but it's a very conscious movement. And I would just, I'm just wondering what advice you'd have, like what you'd say, because you've been in the process of actually, like you say, creating NKA and creating consciously the narratives that go with the narratives, the kind of hand in hand. What advice would you have?
Let me begin by saying that just the comment on the Opie thing. I don't think Opie would have meant for it to be to say that Africa outside the world. Perhaps I wasn't there. Perhaps it's about Africa is excluded from the whole modernist discourse. Perhaps because his show, the Short Century, which happened around the same time that Authentic Eccentric happened. It's all about African modernity. And it's about theorizing it, and it's about making the effort, and then link it to liberation.
Yeah.
And this is something that, in defining African modernity, we have to think of it in the context of decolonization. And we have to think about it as part of this kind of affirmation in the creation of new nations, the idea of a creation of a new identity. That's liberatory, that is part of the whole liberation project. It's about new personality, it's about creating a modern nation and an identity and so forth. But then, of course, the challenge in the context of Africa is how do you really do that in the context of the larger diversity? But I think if you look at negritude, if you look at Pan-Africanism, if you look at all of these intellectual schools, they're all about that. They're raising this question about the identity of African, the identity with art, how do you really create what we... So the question becomes very similar. There is the issue of how do you really create like a Sudanese modernism? How do you really create a Senegalese modernism? How do you create an Egyptian? So history, heritage becomes a reservoir for drawing from to create this kind of ideas. But it's in the context of the confrontation with the West. So African modernity grew out of that kind of thinking. And so to get back to your question, perhaps in answering your question, that I can say a few things about the experience in Venice and why we did it. You have to look at it like this. One of the things that I don't like in the debate that was happening, or happened at least a few years ago, is this kind of who is authentic and who is like the whole idea about how do you really do things in Africa or related to Africa becomes like if you live in the continent you are more authentic, and if you live abroad you are not. So the whole debate became almost like at the end of apartheid between exiles, what they call exiles and exiles. Yeah. So the exiles, we were here, we stuck it, all this time. You guys are coming from abroad, you're living in luxury, not realizing that sometimes we don't choose where we should be. And sometimes also by choice, and we have the ultimate freedom to live. I personally don't believe